So, I think I'll talk for 45 minutes.
40 to 45, I think. I'm going to keep very much within the, time.
Okay. Well, that should give us a good amount of time for discussion.
Yeah. I'd like to get some questions, really.
Mm-hmm. Think you will.
Yeah, hope so. I think I'm going to use the podium, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll get started. I'm sure there will be a few stragglers. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Christian Osterman. I direct the Center's History and Public Policy Program, which of course includes the Cold War International History Project, probably still known much to many more of you than this new program. I'd like to welcome you to a seminar on Henry Kissinger and the Dilemmas of American Power, featuring Professor Thomas Schwartz, Professor of History at Vanderbilt University, and for the last 5-6 months we've had the great pleasure and privilege of having Professor Schwartz here at the Wilson Center as a public policy scholar. Originally, this session was designed as a work in progress, and I think it, in many ways, Tom likes to look at it as a work in progress session. This is a fairly new project that he has been engaging in. He, of course, is the author of a number of important volumes, one of the leading historians of American foreign relations. He's published America's Germany, John J. McCloy and the Federal Republic of Germany, really a classic study of U.S. policy towards Germany after World War II. And then more recently, 2003, Lyndon Johnson in Europe in the shadow of Vietnam, an examination of alliance politics during the Vietnam War. Professor Schwartz's research interests include the interaction between domestic politics and foreign policy, transnational coalitions and alliance politics, as well as the role of the American presidency in alliance leadership and the new international history of the Cold War. As a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center, he has been working on two projects, really. A short history of the Cold War, tentatively entitled The Long Twilight Struggle, and I think his major project here, a biography of former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, tentatively entitled Henry Kissinger and the Dilemmas of American Power. I think his presentation today will be based on 5-6 months of intense research into the Kissinger materials and thinking about Kissinger and American foreign policy. Tom, it's a real pleasure to have you here. The floor is yours.
I want to take a moment here just to thank Lee Hamilton, Sam Wells, and Christian Osterman for their role in making my presence at the Wilson Center possible. I want to thank Mercer and Ryan as well for arranging this, and my research assistant Erin Robinson for her help in accumulating a lot of Kissinger materials. And I want to thank all of you for coming out on a miserable day to listen to this. Being at the Wilson Center is a bit like dying and going to heaven. I've told everybody that between the facilities, the activities, to the smile on Lindsay Collins, our receptionist, every morning that brightens my day. That's not to say that my return to Vanderbilt will be like the alternative of going to heaven, but it makes me very appreciative of what I've had at the Wilson Center. My topic today is Henry Kissinger, Dilemmas of American Power, and it is a work in progress. I welcome your suggestions and criticisms, and you'll see why I think I need that as we go along. I'm somewhat old-fashioned as well. I went to a conference this weekend, and almost every grad student who was presenting, and even younger faculty members, all had PowerPoint of one sort or another, and I wish in some ways I was a little more adept with that. I managed at one point last year in a freshman history class to show my students a picture of Henry Kissinger and to tell them that in a 1972 poll of Playboy bunnies found that he was the man they would most like to date. They all refused to believe this, despite my protestations to the contrary. So I wish in some ways Henry Kissinger does lend himself to a good deal of visual material, and I wish I had more of it with me. And by the time I'm done with this project, I actually will, I hope, accumulate a fair number of visual materials for a presentation. This book, or the book itself, or the project, arose because there is a series produced by the publisher Hill and Wang called American Portraits, and the objective in this series is to use biography to explore larger themes of history. Lou Mazer, the editor of Reviews in American History and the editor of this project, was the first to approach me with this offer and asked me whom I would suggest as a way of studying 20th century American diplomatic history, which was an issue they were concerned with. Kissinger occurred to me right away, but there was initially the problem of dealing with a living person, and a rather litigious one at that. The other biographies in the series are people like Pocahontas, Jonathan Edwards, and Father Junipero Serra, none of whom, as far as I know, has a team of lawyers working for them. My Harvard advisors were also quite reluctant to see me write about Henry Kissinger. One joked, in a reference to Dean Acheson's famous memoir called Present at the Creation, that I should entitle my book Henry Kissinger, Present at the Destruction. They have feelings have not softened in that sense, and so I found there was a fair amount of resistance to taking on Kissinger, and I did consider a number of other figures, Dean Acheson, John Foster Dulles, Cyrus Vance, George Ball, but I kept coming back to Kissinger. And the argument I made in the prospectus for this book was that Kissinger's life does touch on most of the central issues of American diplomatic history in the 20th century. But I also argued that the very length of so many of the other studies of Kissinger led to a certain neglect and superficial treatment of his impact, and that a shorter work would be more effective in the classroom. There's only one other short work on Henry Kissinger, Robert Schultzinger's book, Doctor of Diplomacy. But it was written in the 1980s before the end of the Cold War, the opening up of the papers. There is one other short work, I should say, on Kissinger called Henry Kissinger, Soviet Agent by Frank Capel, but I decided this was not a competitor to my project. It is much harder to write Kissinger if one thinks about condensing or shortening his story. After all, as Tom Blanton of the National Security Archive once put it in a conference, Kissinger is the most documented American public official of the 20th century. Now, of course, some of that is the responsibility of the National Security Archive and people like Bill Burr, who I see here today, who have put up thousands and thousands of pages of Kissinger-related material on their website. Some of that always reminds me of one critic's comment about Henry Kissinger's first book, which was a rather lengthy book called Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. And he wrote, "I don't know whether Mr. Kissinger is a good writer, but anyone who finished this book is a good reader." Kissinger is fairly overwhelming. And I set my goal as trying to create or put together a book of some 250 to 300 pages on Kissinger. And I do find myself constantly reminded of the famous quotation usually attributed to Pascal that the present letter is a very long one simply because I had no leisure to make it shorter. Trying to make a short or concise work on Kissinger, I think, is a challenge. I'm writing this in part also with the undergraduate audience in mind, and I see some people here who I think might be undergraduates, and I will welcome your comments in that regard. Also for the larger public, and this is my first attempt really to write a book as much for a broader public. What this also means, though, is that I make no claims of being comprehensive or exhaustive research on the subject, and that one has to accept a certain amount of limits in that. And that's hard sometimes for diplomatic historians who like to be more certain of their findings. My plan is, therefore, in effect, to write a book that connects Kissinger's life, hopefully in some 7 chapters, to the issues of 20th century diplomacy. Now, one of the central problems confronting any writer about Henry Kissinger is the intense controversy that swirls around the man. Doing a quick Google search before I came in here, I got 6.3 million hits on Henry Kissinger. There are what one might call the contrasting narratives of Kissinger. Jussi Hanamaki wrote an article entitled Dr. Kissinger and Mr. Henry, in which he looked at that debate, playing off, you might say, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde notions. Curiously missing from Jussi's article was a reference to the fact that Kissinger himself actually at one point employed the term Mr. Henry. And he did that when he was an occupation official in Germany to avoid references or thoughts of the Germans to his Jewishness and to emphasize his Americanness. But in any sense, there is this notion of a divide between Dr. Kissinger and Mr. Henry. The Dr. Kissinger is the Kissinger of the heroic narrative, the immigrant, the refugee, the Horatio Alger story, the man whose astonishing success reflects the openness and opportunities of American society, a theme, I think, put forth in memoirs and other books on Kissinger. When he was appointed initially, in a very short-lived appointment, to head up the 9/11 Commission, President Bush called him America's most accomplished and respected public servant. He has had an enormous influence on a wide number of Americans as well, and his protégés have served in government. And to this day, of course, he's out there now as an expert on the World Cup. He's a man with astonishing durability. Now, the other side, of course, of the narrative, the Mr. Henry, one might call it, is the indictment which might be associated with three names, William Shawcross, Seymour Hersh, and Christopher Hitchens. That's the story of the war criminal. Shawcross began this indictment with a famous book in 1979 called Sideshow, about Kissinger's role, as he put it, in the destruction of Cambodia. Seymour Hersh's book portrayed Kissinger as an amoral schemer who was only interested in the aggrandizement of his own power. And more recently, Christopher Hitchens, in his book The Trials of Henry Kissinger, portrayed him as morally and legally responsible for the death and destruction in Vietnam, Cambodia, Chile, and East Timor. This was followed up by a BBC movie on the subject. There's an extraordinary fierceness, you might say, in the moral condemnation of Kissinger, which might be said to equal in its intensity the celebration of Kissinger by others. If one takes a look at the web, though, I would argue that the critics are winning this war. He's probably also the only long-retired American public official whose mere presence can still attract a political demonstration in any appearance he makes. Is the truth somewhere in between? I'm not going to go that way. There's another school of thought which simply seeks to minimize Kissinger's own personal role, that Kissinger wasn't as important as, of course, he himself makes himself out to be, or either his supporters or opponents do. Hanamaki had some of this in his book, suggesting that many of the indictments of Kissinger by his critics are really indictments of American foreign policy, and that Kissinger was oftentimes carrying out a policy shaped by others, especially by Richard Nixon. Other critics, including Wisconsin professor Stanley Cutler or Joan Hoff, also suggest an approach along these lines. I think there is something in this, in fact, and I will argue Kissinger did not play a very important role in one of the most decisive changes that occurred on his watch, namely the demise of the Bretton Woods system and the important changes that brought in the international economy. I'll also argue that Kissinger was hardly a freelancer, and that his efforts do reflect many of the underlying dilemmas of American power in the 20th century, faced by every administration since 1945. These dilemmas, I argue, are inherent in the role of the United States, the role which it plays, as Michael Mandelbaum's recent book discussed it, as a Goliath among world powers, the ultimate guarantor of a system of world order. The managers of American power, and Henry Kissinger is among the most famous, always face genuine dilemmas and choices in their policies, often between very unpalatable alternatives. At certain points, especially in the Kissinger years, a period of relative decline in American power, a weak economy, a polarized public opinion, and military stalemate in Vietnam, those choices were bleak. Anthony Hartley, a very perceptive British analyst of this time, once wrote about America's dilemmas during this time, that military failure is traditionally the most brutal of shocks to any governing class. I think Kissinger understood this, and as disagreeable and controversial as many of his methods were, they need to be recognized in part as shaped by the context of his times. Now, within those limits, I would still contend to focus on Kissinger himself as valid. Kissinger was the most celebrated American diplomat of the 20th century, a man who for a roughly 5-year period, from his secret trip to China to the defeat of Gerald Ford, absolutely captured the attention of the American and world media, traveled with an entourage worthy of royalty, became an international celebrity. The power that he seemed to possess peaked during the Watergate scandal, when Kissinger himself seemed to be in charge of the U.S. government. Or, as another Secretary of State and aide to Kissinger, Larry Eagleburger, once put it, there's no question during that period of time, Henry did not, on many occasions, really go to the president and ask for authority. He just did it. Interestingly enough, Alistair Horn, one of the two authorized biographers of Kissinger, the other is Harvard professor Nigel Ferguson, focuses his own study on 1973, the year that, for all intents and purposes, Kissinger became president of the United States and the director of American foreign policy. For the rest of my talk, what I want to do is describe the 7 chapters I want to write, which are all in bits and pieces now, which force me to be selective about what I emphasize, where I think I have some new materials and not otherwise commonly cited insights, as well as some of my criticisms and conclusions and tentative conclusions about Kissinger's role. Chapter 1 I call The Refugee. It's really not very difficult to link Henry Kissinger's early life to the great themes of American power in the 20th century. After all, Henry Kissinger, from a German Jewish background, only survives to become Henry Kissinger because he is able to come to the United States, unlike the many relatives of his who would perish in the Holocaust. Kissinger's life is symbolic of the importance of World War II and America's conflict with Hitler's Germany, which thrust the United States into the global arena as a superpower convinced of its own righteousness, of its causes, and the necessity of its role in the post-war world. Much more on Kissinger's early life, though, will probably come when Jeremy Surrey, a prominent young historian at Wisconsin who's done a great deal of work on Kissinger's German background, publishes his own work. Despite a rather thorough Americanization, Kissinger retained a connection and even affection for Germany that many fellow German Jews lost completely. I will argue in the first chapter that one of the most important aspects in understanding Kissinger's early life is his role in the occupation. The American occupation and transformation of Germany has become one of the central symbols of 20th century American foreign policy. Indeed, many of you will recall how often it was brought out during the initial build-up and then the post-war period on Iraq. The idea of America and Germany was the central analogy that was used to justify that. On the Kissinger story, the leadership and responsibility that Kissinger himself would enjoy as a member of the U.S. Army and then as a director in the occupation was significant in leading him to ambitions far beyond those of what might have been just an accountant in New York City to someone with a much more ambitious agenda. There was a psychological transformation, I argue, that went on from the refugee to the man with extraordinary political authority in his former homeland. Kissinger dealt with Germans remarkably free of bitterness. Once when he talked about rounding up Gestapo members as a member of the occupation, he wrote, "It surprised me because I had the impression that the Gestapo were all monsters. In fact, they were mainly miserable little bureaucrats." Now, for those of you who know, the word bureaucrat took on a certain symbolic importance for Kissinger. Kissinger himself would struggle against bureaucracy for most of his career, and I find it important or interesting that he refers to Gestapo members in that light. But I think that's a central issue in Kissinger's early life, was this role in the occupation and authority that he had in his former homeland. In Chapter 2, I approach what I call Kissinger the academic, and tracking his extraordinary career in academia, to the point when in 1968, I would argue, during that election campaign, he likely would have become the choice as National Security Advisor for both either Richard Nixon or Hubert Humphrey. Kissinger's main scholarship in these years dealt with both nuclear weapons and alliance management, central issues to American policymakers of the time. Yet here, in this particular chapter, I'm going to emphasize Kissinger's relationship with Nelson Rockefeller, one of the most important American leaders, political leaders, who didn't become president. He's not very well known. His name only survives in terms of one would hear it as Rockefeller Republican, a very rare breed these days. This was one of the most important relationships, though, Kissinger had with American patrons. He had a number of patrons during the course of his life: William Yandell Elliott, a Harvard political scientist; Fritz Kramer, a German refugee as well. The relationship with Rockefeller is a fascinating one. Kissinger wrote of it in terms of a relationship with an older brother. It remained very warm into the Nixon period, where the records of the telephone communications find Kissinger at one point telling Nelson that he owed him his career, and that he would never have become what he was without Nelson Rockefeller. There was a type of payback in this. Kissinger's support for Rockefeller for vice president when Gerald Ford selected him in 1974 can be seen in that light. But it's also, I think, a fascinating reflection of Kissinger's own thoughts on the subject. Joseph Persico, who was an aide to Rockefeller, noted that for Nelson Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger, each man was an affirmation to the other of the country's infinite promise. Kissinger possessed the type of brilliance and egotism that Rockefeller was fascinated by. Rockefeller possessed the extraordinary wealth and power that fascinated Kissinger. The documents from the Rockefeller collection make it clear that Kissinger developed some of his many techniques: flattery, ingratiation, extraordinary hard work, extraordinary speech writing, that he would later use to win Richard Nixon's confidence during his years really with Nelson Rockefeller. What is also intriguing is the type of foreign policy advice that the young Kissinger gave to Rockefeller, who was himself seeking to differentiate his views from Eisenhower's approach to foreign policy. The Kissinger of these years, in the 1950s, is a surprisingly energetic Cold Warrior, and he even reminds one of the neoconservatives who would become among the banes of his existence when he was Secretary of State. There's a great irony in this, because Kissinger's own emphasis during this time on the psychological and moral dimensions of the Cold War, there's something in even approaching and paralleling the later neoconservative criticism of his détente policies. Kissinger criticized the Eisenhower administration for its status quo orientation, the legalistic approach he saw in Dulles and Dulles' aide, Robert Bowie. Bowie would later become one of Kissinger's principal enemies when he was at Harvard. Kissinger frequently told Rockefeller, "We seem obsessed with risk. They, the Soviets, seem conscious of opportunities." In his reaction to the Hungarian crisis, he wrote a letter in December of 1956, quote, "There is something pedantic and petty about the notion so generally advanced that somehow it is our task to moderate the revolution in Eastern Europe, and that the Soviets are in such difficulties that we shall inherit the world without any effort on our part. All of this seems to indicate a moral weakness rather than an analytical one on the part of the free world. What really seems to be lacking in us is a sense of mission." Ironically enough, of course, that sense of mission and missionary enthusiasms in general would become one of the main factors in American foreign policy that the elder Kissinger would seek to curb. One other aspect of his career as a Rockefeller advisor is particularly noteworthy. He served as the chair of a study group for the Rockefeller Foundation, the Special Studies Project. Rockefeller's idea was to develop studies on the problems facing the United States over the next 5 to 10 years. It was a large-scale study project. In running the project, which involved a multitude of contributors, endless meetings, and very complex politics, Kissinger frequently reflected that, quote, "the internal workings of whatever machine we are caught up is more complicated than the problems for which the machine was designed in the first place," something that would foreshadow his own attempt to simplify and centralize foreign policy-making machinery of the American government. After dealing with these two aspects of Kissinger's career, I will plunge into, in Chapter 3, The Advisor, Kissinger's first 2 years as National Security Advisor for Richard Nixon. What I'm struck by most in my research of the first 2 years, 2 to 2.5 years of the Nixon administration, is the overall failure of that administration in substantive terms, whether it be in Vietnam with the disastrous intervention in Cambodia and Laos, the stalled negotiations with the Russians over the SALT agreement, the loss of leadership to Germany and Ostpolitik in Europe, continuing conflicts in the Middle East, the lack of progress with China, and the fall in Nixon's own domestic support, Nixon and Kissinger did begin the withdrawal from Vietnam and articulate the Nixon doctrine of reducing American military intervention and providing American support through military and economic assistance alone. But it's the relative failure of their foreign policy in substantive terms in their first 2 years that stands out. Where they were successful, however, was not in the substance of policy, but in setting up a system. And that system to implement changes in American foreign policy. It involved the centralization of power in the White House through the National Security Council, with a deep emphasis on secrecy and centralized power in the hands of Nixon and Kissinger. In the short term, Nixon and Kissinger's new system would afford the United States a system that had the speed, secrecy, and flexibility to conduct an audacious foreign policy that would both shock allies and surprise adversaries. But it also enjoyed a certain political acclaim at home. Now, there were costs to this system. There was a loss of expertise that came from keeping materials to only a few. The secrecy that was involved in this system would lead to a culture of wiretapping that would have its own long-term impacts on the Nixon administration. But it also, I think, would reflect and reflected a attitude about bureaucracy that was deeply felt by both Nixon and Kissinger. In his recent book, Blind Oracles, which is a devastating analysis of the role of intellectuals in power, the University of Pennsylvania historian Bruce Kuklick argues that in their disregard of foreign policy bureaucracies, Nixon and Kissinger reflected the views of many other Harvard intellectuals, like Richard Neustadt, who saw the pitfalls of bureaucracies and wanted, certainly in a more well-mannered way, to overcome these problems for the executive. The irony, as Kuklick makes clear, was that this system would make Kissinger the defense intellectual who was most successful in applying his ideas to policy. It was also an innovation that foreign governments immediately perceived. They quickly came to recognize that they needed to learn to work this system. Not surprisingly, the quickest learners were the British, who always strived to both get along and attempt to manipulate the disagreements within the American government in their favor. But even they found the Nixon-Kissinger system daunting. Lord Cromer referred to the new structure of power in Washington as the Kissinger syndrome. He also talked about 20th century Byzantium, and many of his dispatches to the Prime Minister contained the warning that, and I quote, Kissinger's main fear is that we will inadvertently forget the source of this information and mention items to the State Department or the U.S. Embassy. Curiously enough, it was Dobrynin and the Russians who most appreciated this approach, and Kissinger told Nixon that Dobrynin became an advocate for a similar system in the Soviet Union. Later, when the system was still operating in 1973, Cromer discussed an episode that the British referred to as Operation Hullabaloo, during which Kissinger recruited Sir Thomas Brownlow from the Foreign Office to draft an agreement on preventing nuclear war. Quote, we were struck by the astonishing anomaly of the most powerful nation in the world invoking the aid of a foreign government to do its drafting for it, while totally excluding its own Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It is ludicrous and must change. But Cromer went on to write, meanwhile, given the fact that this administration works in this most extraordinary way, we must be thankful that at least it gives us the opportunity of making our views known and perhaps influencing their courses of action. But it is a dangerous and complicated path that we tread, and I am always aware of the pitfalls that lurk on the other side. That system, I think, did make and prepare the way for what I will write about in Chapter 4, what I call, tentatively, the Trifecta plus one, namely the achievement of a set of accomplishments, the SALT agreement with the Russians, the opening of China, the Vietnam Peace Accords, and the new economic policy. I use the term Trifecta plus one because it was Kissinger who used the term trifecta to refer to the first three. He never included the economic change because he himself played such a little role in that when talking to Nixon. These three achievements, I think, in part came about in their timing and their circumstances because of the system that the Nixon and Kissinger team had set up. The summit with the Russians on the SALT agreement led to the first agreements on the limitation of nuclear weapons. The opening to China, an event which, despite a certain amount of revisionism that set in, particularly about its relationship to Taiwan, still was extraordinary in its exploitation of the Sino-Soviet split and the opportunities afforded American diplomacy, and I think cannot be underestimated for the shockwaves it created and the openings it allowed for American diplomats of this time. Finally, the peace agreement with the North Vietnamese, which is the most ambiguous of these three achievements. Here, one of the central controversies concerns the so-called decent interval thesis, that Nixon and Kissinger sought merely a decent interval of time between the withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam and the fall of Saigon. The problem with this view, as Kuklik himself notes, is that it rests on a belief in Kissinger's ability to see the future that neither he nor anyone else had. It also undervalues Nixon's intense focus on the extrication of the U.S. from Vietnam in a way that preserved what for him was its self-respect as a great power. Finally, there's the new economic policy of this time. Kissinger, as I said, didn't include this because it had not been his initiative. Each of these four could require their own book, but I think in these four came the real impact that Nixon-Kissinger diplomacy had. These are when the world recognized that Nixon represented something new, that the United States was changing its approach in ways that many saw as more nationalist, more limited, more realistic, but also more creative. Even those hurt by the policies, such as the West Europeans, often recognized the value and importance of these changes. Finally, the next chapter that I will deal with in Chapter 5 is on shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East. This chapter operates on the premise that Kissinger plays a decisive role during the Watergate in guiding American foreign policy, in particular with its focus on the Middle East in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. In courting Sadat, in making the United States the central and overwhelming power in the Middle East, this feature of the Kissinger era is a vital transition between the concerns of the Cold War and the post-Cold War eras, including the War on Terrorism era of American foreign policy. Forcing the Soviet Union out of the Middle East and assuming American leadership was in no sense an unambiguous positive achievement, but it was an achievement that can be laid at Kissinger's door. In Chapter 6, I'll explore Kissinger during the Ford years, perhaps also the least, at least at this time, constructed of my chapters, but quite important. This period is remembered for the fall of Saigon and Kissinger's failures in Angola and the resurgence of congressional veto power and the decline of détente. But it was also a time of rather wholesale changes in many arenas of American foreign policy, particularly in its policy toward Africa. It was also a point of change in Kissinger's own style of diplomacy, and many adaptations particularly deserve more emphasis than they have received, particularly a resurgence and interest and practice of alliance diplomacy with the major Western powers. And finally, the last chapter, which I hope to write, will be on Kissinger's legacy and the post-governmental career that he enjoyed. It's sometimes hard to believe that Henry Kissinger had not been in an official government position really for the last 30 years, but he has had such a profound continuing influence. Most importantly, this was seen in the Carter period, where he was considered as having practically veto power over such issues as the Panama Canal Treaty and the SALT agreements. But he was still influential, even if viewed critically during the Reagan and Bush years, especially on matters of China. His protégés, Ben Scowcroft, Lawrence Eagleburger, Paul Bremer, have played a continuing role in American foreign policy. Kissinger's also private activities, Kissinger and Associates, have played a role in promoting some aspects of globalization. I'm running a little short on time, but I want to make 5 more points. And these points come from the perspective of today and are in line with the adage that each generation writes its own history and that Henry Kissinger's significance will always be in the process of being reevaluated and reconsidered. This doesn't mean I'm practicing Kissinger revisionism, but it does mean that my perspectives on Kissinger are shaped, at least in part, by the history we've experienced since he held power. I want to focus on 2 weaknesses in Kissinger's approach. There are others, and in fact, many of you might want to raise those during question period. The first is this lack of interest in international economic diplomacy. Kissinger's reluctance to engage in matters of economic diplomacy, one of the few areas which he actually admitted freely was not his strong suit, should figure more strongly in the critiques of his diplomacy than it has. Most critiques really usually emphasize moral questions, but these are far more complex than authors are willing to recognize and much less black and white than they're presented. But Kissinger's relative neglect of economic questions undermined his diplomacy. It's curious because he certainly understood the degree to which economic issues were connected with successful political power and diplomatic power. His work on the Rockefeller study groups had brought him into contact with a wide range of economic questions and their connections to important political matters. Some thought his resistance had to do with ego. Assistant Secretary Willis Armstrong, who was no fan of Kissinger, in an oral history, recalled trying to brief Kissinger on the dangers of an oil embargo in 1972. Quote, "He just didn't seem to pay much attention," Armstrong recalled. When asked if this had to do with the fact that Kissinger, quote, "had theories, and this was sort of a reflection that these theories can often be disturbed by economic problems," Armstrong replied, quote, "No, I think he was just allergic to economic matters. You have to remember that Kissinger always looked at every situation in terms of what is there in it that will do something for me. In economics, there isn't anything that will do anything for anybody. There's no room for an ego trip or fancy negotiation." Now, whether Armstrong's right or not, Kissinger did absent himself from what some historians now regard as a more decisive turning point in the post-war order, the end of Bretton Woods and the American decision to cut the link between dollar and gold. That decision, along with a 10% surcharge on imports, caused more consternation among the Allies than anything the United States ever did in Vietnam, and it eventually forced Kissinger to act to restore U.S. relations with the major trading nations. George Schwartz actually describes quite effectively how Kissinger came to realize that Connolly's blunt tactics were endangering the alliance, and he set up a series of bilateral meetings between Nixon and European leaders to settle the controversies. But in effect, in absenting himself from this arena of decision-making, and ultimately in acquiescing in the triumph of the neoliberal vision of people like Schwartz, that neoliberal vision which embraced flexible exchange rates and a much greater acceptance of the role of transnational market forces in the world economy, ironically enough, Kissinger presided over a weakening of the nation-state-centered system of international relations, the entity which he identified as central to the maintenance of international equilibrium and stability. Now, there may not have been much choice in this. A new Bretton Woods-type system would have required enormous efforts at international cooperation on the part of Western policymakers. But still, the result is one of the many ironies of Kissinger's tenure. The second thing I would point to as a weakness in Kissinger diplomacy was a certain contempt and indifference to middle powers. This tendency was captured in a dialogue between Kissinger and the Canadian ambassador to Washington, Marcel Cadoux, taking place shortly before a Nixon trip to Canada. Kissinger rejected the idea that the Nixon doctrine and the recent events in Nixon policy that I've mentioned was, in his discussion with Cadoux, was some form of resorting to balance of power politics similar to the 19th century. And he extolled it as a way for countries like Canada to flourish in their own way, making independent judgments on domestic affairs, but doing so within an international framework of continuing close association with the U.S. In classic Kissinger fashion, he said to Cadoux, "After all, is there anywhere else for all of you to go?" Cadoux acknowledged to his superiors in writing this up that he recognized there was some truth in Kissinger's blunt statement, but he told Kissinger that international relations were more complex than he had indicated, and that he overlooked a range of options for medium and smaller powers in their relations with other parts of the world and international organizations and among themselves, especially in regard to economic issues, which Kissinger confessed he found rather mysterious. Now, Kissinger also often expressed this type of contempt for countries like Italy, Austria, surprisingly enough as well, also for Japan. Sometimes I think Kissinger's own sense of humor couldn't help itself. When the Australian ambassador came in at one point and asked him to visit Pretoria, Kissinger told him if he had any business in Antarctica, he'll be glad to stop off in Australia on his way down there or coming back. Kissinger then had to send out a State Department official to tell the ambassador he was only kidding. These two are connected, though, because I think Kissinger's insufficient attention to economics led him to miss its role as a factor in national power that often was significant for middle powers. Now let me talk about three general conclusions I'm drawing from my study, which I think will steer it away from some of the conventional wisdom about Henry Kissinger. And the first has to deal with Kissinger and realism. And this, I think, draws itself from the fact that Kissinger's extensive academic scholarship before he became National Security Advisor created, I think, the illusion of a detailed planning and fixed strategy. In fact, as all of you know, architecture was his preferred metaphor, with constant references to building a new structure of peace. And hence, Jussi Hanamäki entitled his criticism in a very comprehensive book that came out of here and came out of the Wilson Center a couple of years ago. He called that The Flawed Architect. In fact, I think architecture is the wrong metaphor for what Kissinger really achieved. In fact, Kissinger was something of a master of improvisation, reactive diplomacy, and the seizure of opportunities. I've been playing with this notion of a better metaphor, and I have to admit the one that's recently come to mind is that of a skilled soccer player having to deal with a game that's perpetually in motion. Kissinger himself, in his newly created form as a World Cup analyst, wrote recently that soccer at its highest level is complexity masquerading as simplicity, and there is in that something of his own foreign policy. Over the time he was in office, Kissinger's improvisational skills allowed him to seize on different approaches, both power politics and balancing of the first term, but followed by a much stronger multilateralism and alliance policy in his second term. It's also worth noting that despite his emphasis on cold-bloodedness in the making of foreign policy, in the sort of tradition of realists, foreign diplomats frequently found Kissinger anything but, and indeed saw him as occasionally emotional, sentimental, prone to fits of anger and pique, and possessed of a wicked sense of humor, indeed a very human character, despite his overarching importance in the concentration of power he seemed to represent. A British analysis produced for the incoming Labour government in March of 1974 reflected this. Quote, "Despite his high intelligence and conceptual approach to foreign policy, by no means do all of Kissinger's actions form part of a coherent master plan aimed at promoting the United States' political advantage. Mood, emotion, and the circumstances of his own background — he is the first immigrant ever to become U.S. Secretary of State and is very conscious of the dignity of his office — are powerful conditioning factors. They, on occasion, lead him to personalize his dealings with foreign countries and to inflate specific issues into the, quote, touchstone of relations with them." In fact, the arch-realist was anything but. His own emphasis on psychological and moral factors in the making of foreign policy, as well as his own personalized style, detracted from his self-professed desire to deal with issues in a cold-blooded and realist fashion. The second point I'd like to make that I think would draw away from some of the conventional wisdom about Kissinger is the significance of Europe in Kissinger's thinking. Whatever neglect of Europe is apparent in Kissinger's first years is replaced by a courting of allies in his last 4 years in office. In the meetings of the quadripartite group, what Kissinger described in his memoirs as the inner group to conduct the affairs of the alliance, which evolved that was very similar to the directorate that Charles de Gaulle had proposed, he had faced a recognition of the role of the Allies in projecting American power. In April of 1973, as he was contemplating his Year of Europe initiative, a British diplomat asked Kissinger, quote, "What are the United States so concerned with Europe? What is its essential importance to them?" He then recounted, the British diplomat recounted, quote, "Kissinger took the question very seriously, and his answer was framed not, as I half expected, in geopolitical terms, but initially in terms of United States domestic politics. If the United States could not rely on Europe, the national morale would be progressively undermined, radicalism, either of the right or the left, would develop by successive stages, and the whole of United States society would assume an increasingly regimented character." Kissinger has often been criticized for getting along with America's enemies better than he did with the Allies, and some even suggest that he preferred dictators like Brezhnev and Mao to the Europeans. But I would argue that in his more nuanced moments, and as a part of the development of his diplomacy, relations with Europe came to be more and more important to him, both for these interesting domestic reasons, but also as a way to guarantee the more judicious and legitimate exercise of American power. Kissinger went on to tell his British interlocutor that there were, quote, geopolitical reasons as well for the concern with Europe. Quote, "In the international context, the United States' ability to influence affairs would decline. Latin America would go over to the Soviet Union. Japan would follow, and China, which would be watching narrowly for any shift in the United States' position or diminution in United States influence, would move in the same direction. In short, the United States could not afford, either domestically or in terms of international influence, to become isolated in the world." And curiously enough, this is one of the arguments, very similar to the argument George Kennan made back in 1946 for why the United States needed to maintain strong connections with European democracies. Connected to this, I think, also was a feeling for Germany, and despite his exasperation with many German leaders, this remained a frequent sympathy and appreciation for a German viewpoint on issues, as well, I think, as a particularly close relationship with British leaders during this time. The third point I'd like to make that also, I think, is designed to move away from some of the traditional pictures of Kissinger is the importance of domestic politics in Kissinger's thinking. Kissinger's geopolitical thinking is often elevated as held in contrast to the crass political concerns about domestic politics. In fact, of course, domestic politics frequently plays an extraordinary role in Kissinger's thought and actions on a whole variety of levels. The tapes clearly reveal Kissinger's understanding of Nixon's domestic political needs, especially in regard to Vietnam. This cuts in many directions. It argued against the rapid abandonment of South Vietnam in 1969 for fear of a right-wing reaction. Despite a realist sense of the irrelevance of South Vietnam in larger strategic vision, it argued for the decent interval, or one could more positively say a decent opportunity approach of guaranteeing South Vietnam had a chance to survive, and that its demise did not happen too rapidly and certainly too quickly before the 1972 presidential elections. Kissinger also cared deeply about congressional relations. Kempton Jenkins, the Assistant Secretary for Congressional Relations, put it, next to the press, he considered Congress the most important instrument he had. And Jenkins tells a story about Kissinger's attendance at a birthday party for the congressional leader Wayne Hayes, a gesture that paid off a few months later in preventing a bill aimed at slashing military assistance to Korea. Hayes told Jenkins at the time, you go back and tell Henry Kissinger that these sons of bitches will vote with him on this issue or they won't park within 12 miles of the Capitol building. It was Kissinger's attention to domestic politics, which is not normally thought, but was certainly there. Now, the other side to domestic politics was the attempt to build support for policy that Kissinger undertook in the summer of 1975 after the collapse of Saigon. With an appointed president and political attacks from the right and the left on his policy, Kissinger undertook an attempt to educate the American people in the complexities and dilemmas of foreign policy. Now, Hanamaki, in his book, refers to the speeches as reflecting Kissinger's unapologetic realpolitik. But I think in one of the rare moments where I really disagree with Jussi, I think he's greatly oversimplifies this message. What Kissinger sought to do in the wake of the defeat in Vietnam and the degree to which that defeat had encouraged a deep pessimism about foreign policy was to argue for a new understanding of American foreign policy. In his speech in Minnesota, for example, he argued, quote, for Americans, then, the question is not whether our values should affect our foreign policy, but how. The issue is whether we have the courage to face complexity and the inner conviction to deal with ambiguity, whether we look behind easy slogans and recognize that great goals can only be reached by patience and in imperfect stages. Or in another speech about the limits of American power, quote, today we find, like most other nations in history, we can neither escape from the world nor dominate it. Today we must conduct diplomacy with subtlety, flexibility, maneuver, and imagination in the pursuit of our interests. We must be thoughtful in defining our interest. We must prepare against the worst contingency and not only plan for the best. We must pursue limited objectives and many objectives simultaneously. As National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, Kissinger's task was to adjust American power to realities after a burst of missionary enthusiasm had led to a divisive and controversial and unsuccessful war. The great irony is that Henry Kissinger, the first all-star celebrity diplomat of the American century, whose fame and importance were themselves symbols of how significant American power remained in the world in the 1970s, ended up preaching the limits of American power and the need for Americans to accept a world that would not automatically bend to America's ideological dreams. In that sense, his words and the dilemmas of power in the Kissinger years certainly remain relevant today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Wilson Center President Lee Hamilton reminds us on the senior staff on a regular basis that the scholars he likes to see here, the senior scholars, ought to be preeminent scholars, preeminent in their field. And I think this work in progress shows that this description very much fits Professor Schwartz. And So I thank you for this very thoughtful presentation. We now have about 35 minutes or so for questions and comments. If you could please identify yourself and then pose a question. Yes, Malcolm Byrne. And there's a microphone, yeah.
Malcolm Byrne from the National Security Archive. I'm fascinated by your discussion, and since I'm going through something similar, trying to write a big account in a small way, I'm learning a lot already about how to do that. Many questions arise, but I'll just take one for now. In your study of the documents and other resources, I don't know if you have done interviews to any large extent or plan to talk to Kissinger or any of his advisors, but in all of that, have you come to any conclusions about the influence that Kissinger may have had on Nixon and vice versa? You always hear about it's Nixonger, it's Nixon and Kissinger together, but how did they influence each other in their thinking and policy making?
That's the often the 64,000 or whatever number question about Nixon and Kissinger. I tend to feel that, especially in the first years that Nixon and Kissinger operated together, that Kissinger was extraordinarily aware of the fact that his only constituency was the President of the United States, and so his very much, there's a German word, Fingerspitzgefühl, the sort of antennas that he had for Nixon's sentiments were quite tuned to Richard Nixon's sensibilities. And I think in many ways there's an element, that it's something I thought about not too long ago, and I forgive me if I sound like I'm slipping into national character here, but back when Konrad Adenauer had a meeting with Dean Acheson, one of his first meetings after when he was Chancellor of Germany, he told Acheson, Germans take on the color of the wall. They're almost chameleon-like. And there was a way in which Henry Kissinger adapted to Richard Nixon, as he had adapted to Nelson Rockefeller. That didn't mean that he gave up all of his ideas, but he learned ways in which to bring them about. And I think he already shared a fundamentally very similar outlook on the world as Richard Nixon, and he looked for ways to do that, either through implementation or other ways to carry that out. What I think is curious, and the Middle East is one of the areas where I think is actually quite reflective here, because this was not an area that Kissinger was given much authority, and yet he himself is able gradually, by playing on Nixon's concerns about Soviet power in the region, to undermine Secretary of State Rogers' supposed control over this area of policymaking, so that by early 1971 it's very clearly back in Kissinger's under Kissinger's authority. So I think Kissinger did show an amazing ability to be tuned in to Nixon's thinking and concerns on issues. Nixon liked to argue that he dealt with only the big issues, so that gave a great deal of room for Kissinger in dealing with, you might say, the details to affect policy. But I do think there is a way in which Kissinger is very sensitive to Nixon's preferences. There are some conflicts, and particularly, I think, over the summit, where you see, I think, Kissinger much more interested in preserving the summit and much more willing to not to intervene as drastically in Vietnam during the Spring Offensive. Kissinger is clearly more interested in getting a peace accord in October of 1972 than Nixon is. So there are minor areas of difference, but the overall picture is, I think, one of very similar thinking. Now, where it changes, of course, is 1973, and I would argue that as Nixon's political power wanes in Watergate, Kissinger is able to operate much more independently and is able, in the period from about mid-1973 through the end of Nixon's presidency, to operate quite on his own, in his own thinking. And with Ford, I'm not as sure. I think at the beginning of Ford's presidency, he has more independence than he does toward the end. Yeah. Do you want to call on? Go ahead.
My name is Stephen Shore with PBGC. There are two fairly minor episodes that you did not comment on, that by contemporary standards, Kissinger was sort of wrong and surprised. These are Portugal, which in the newspaper accounts at the time he seemed quite resigned that would go communist, and Cyprus, where he was almost open in his gladness that Makarios had been overthrown, almost blissfully unaware that this set in circumstance the division which continues. So does your research have any new insights on these two nations?
I hope I haven't given you the sense that I think Kissinger is right all the time. I don't. I think part of the problem with dealing with Kissinger is that there were big issues that preoccupied him. There were many other issues. If you go to the web for famous quotations connected to Henry Kissinger, there's a number of them you see. My favorite, of course, is the academic politics are so vicious because the stakes are so small. But there's one of the other ones is there can't be a crisis this week, my schedule is full. And there was a way in which the rapidity of crises, particularly in 1974 and 75, found Kissinger completely reactive and I think frequently wrong, as he was in 74 over the Greek coup. On Portugal, his pessimism, I think, reflects it reflects something that was almost in his genes, was a certain pessimism about power and about what was happening, especially in that period of time when the Portuguese coup takes place. I think the one thing to his credit, which you find in Carlucci's oral history and others, is a willingness to back off when he was faced with expertise. And also there, I would argue, and I won't say I can go to the wall on this one yet, but I think the influence of the switch toward greater alliance diplomacy had its role, in that he was more willing to listen to the allies on this one, particularly the Germans and the French and the British, on this issue. And that led him, I think, to not to make more serious mistakes than he might have made otherwise. And so I think in that regard, as it comes toward the end of his period in office, I think reflects the fact that he could be quite mistaken, and he frequently was very suspicious about Eurocommunism, these sorts of things, but that he also had come to a point where he was at least willing to see the insights of others in a way that he might have been less so earlier on.
Daniel Fisher from the Hudson Institute. I was wondering what in your research led you to conclude that Hubert Humphrey would have also chosen Kissinger as his national security advisor?
I confess there that that's a hunch, but it's a hunch based on what is an extraordinarily cordial, friendly, and cooperative relationship that existed between the two of them and remained. It's really quite extraordinary reading the telephone calls and the records of their conversations. In that sense, I'm probably going a little far to say he would have gotten National Security Advisor, but he was up for a fairly significant position in a Humphrey cabinet as well. What I guess, trying to shorten what I'm saying here doesn't allow me to do is to say that what Henry Kissinger had done in 1968 was figure out where the center of American politics was and hug it as hard as he could to his heart. And he was at that center. He was hoping, in a sense, and he had established a reputation in his diplomacy within the Johnson administration and carrying out some of the secret missions that he had been involved in for them for peace negotiations. He had already earned substantial credit with McNamara, with Rusk, and others in the administration. McNamara particularly was quite positively impressed with Kissinger. That I think he would have stood in very strong stead for a position among the Democrats as well. There may have been opposition, of course, because of his ties to Rockefeller, but Humphrey might have been willing to do so in part to demonstrate a certain toughness about national security had he come into office. This is all, I confess, very speculative. My point is, though, that I think that what it really reflects is Kissinger's own tuning in to where what he saw as the center of American politics and foreign policy was in 1968.
Yeah. Gentleman up front.
Eugene Foley and Associates. I want to confirm what you just said about Humphrey. I was close to Hubert Humphrey, but there are others that know the subject better than I do. But Kissinger definitely would have been National Security Advisor under Humphrey.
I appreciate it. I appreciate the every now and then you get something like that in one of these, and it's well worth it. Thank you.
Okay, Mark Moore and then Bob Hathaway, both with the Asia program here.
Well, thanks, Christian. Mark Moore from the Wilson Center. You mentioned, I kind of focus on Asia and China, and you mentioned that Kissinger was more or less focused on Europe. He is criticized of playing the China card, using the China card, and of course he would always respond that no, he respected China for its own sake, which logical. But yet I can't remember the citation, but in one of Kissinger's books, early on in the first 10 pages, and like about page 2, he says, I've been the thing, but it's balanced. Then in about page 8, he says, I go to Nixon and we're figuring out this visit to China, and then I immediately call in the Soviet ambassador because I know it's going to. So what is your take on, his views towards the Soviet Union and China?
I think, and here, I think one of the challenges is expressing this in language that's both careful and recognizes, you might say, the ways in which there can be these sort of very elaborate rationalizations of policy, and yet very tactical understandings of what can be used to exploit, what things can be exploited. It's very clear that Kissinger picked up the sensitivity of the Soviet Union toward any move of the United States toward China. And people here, perhaps who know the Soviet Union better than I do, this seems to have become a refrain of Soviet thinking from 1965 or 66 on. I remember when I was working on my Johnson book, how struck I was by already in 1966 the ways in which Kosygin would discuss the fears that Russians had about China. And he certainly, I think, recognized that this seemed to be a sensitive matter that could get a reaction out of the Soviet Union. And if I gave the impression I thought Kissinger was more concerned about Europe, I guess I overdid it, because I think Kissinger did see things in this global way, and he certainly, China is so central to his understanding of his achievements that you can't get away from that. So I would not by any means want to downplay that. I just think that what's been missed in the literature is the degree to which he also had this tie to Europe. So I guess that's what I'm trying to correct a little bit. But I see this connection to China and the importance of China, and seeing how it seemed to produce movement with the Soviet Union as being absolutely critical.
Thank you. Dr. Hathaway.
I'm Bob Hathaway here to Senator Tom. Terrific presentation. What do you make of the stories about Kissinger's role in sabotaging the Paris Peace Accords before and during the '68 election?
I don't put anything past Kissinger, in the sense that I think he was someone who was trying to play both sides during that time. And I think there's no question that he talked to the Republicans, and he gave messages about the movement, possible movement of the talks toward the end of October that got to Nixon, and that then Nixon told Tu as well, or messages got to Tu. I guess my point would be that neither Nixon nor Tu needed this in any sense to know what their response would be. It may have helped in some minor way, but there was no way in which Tu didn't recognize that any sort of sudden rush to a peace was going to be damaging to his interest, and so that to the extent that he had any ability to hold it up, he was probably going to do so under any circumstances. I also simply don't think there was much in the cards in terms of any sort of final peace of settlement that could have been obtained in 1968. North Vietnam's determination to see the Tu government overthrown or at least replaced, I think, would have been a stumbling block under any circumstances. And at that point, I don't see in their negotiating positions any flexibility that would have allowed a different outcome. I understand. I think what's interesting to me is there's a sort of a constant refrain that comes in American elections of the sort of so-called October surprise, which really got started in 1968 of thinking about that, but actually has roots even earlier, the idea of some last-minute event having an effect on the election. I think this tends to be more an internal American thing and closer to our own mythologies than it is, I think, something with any real impact. Just as it was in 1980, I simply don't buy that there was a conspiracy to make sure that the hostages weren't released.
Thank you. Yes.
I was wondering if you could comment on...
Please identify yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name's Ryan Sturgill. I'm a research intern for Aaron Miller here at the Wilson Center. Could you comment a little bit more on Kissinger's diplomacy in the Middle East, particularly with the view towards how he dealt with domestic political sensitivities during the time? More specifically, I guess, with the American Jewish community?
Yeah. This is a hard question, for one. First of all, of course, many of you know that one of the reasons, at least Nixon said, he didn't give the Middle East portfolio to Kissinger early on was because of a fear that Kissinger, because he was Jewish, would not be able to be objective or would not be perceived as being objective. That's probably the better way of putting it. And there are some ramblings in the tapes where Nixon muses about this with Haldeman, for example, about the fact that how could he be objective about in a situation where so many of his fellow countrymen, or not countrymen, he doesn't use that term, but where so many Jews have been killed, he can't be objective about Israel. So there's something, at least early on, that at least led Nixon to think that it had to be handled differently. And Nixon certainly, at least on the surface of it, argued that he was relatively immune to the political influence of the American Jewish community. After all, they didn't vote for him, they didn't give money to him, so he was going to try to carry out objective policy. On the other hand, Nixon fully appreciated Israel's role in the Cold War. And saw Israel as a vital strategic asset in the Middle East. And in that sense, I think, at least to the extent and to the period of time in which Nixon and Kissinger were conducting diplomacy together, I think the Jewish lobby or Jewish influence in the United States was not that important to the question of whether the United States would support Israel. That was there already because of the Cold War implications. Where it gets more curious, of course, is Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy and his efforts in 1973, 74, 75 to broker an agreement. It's clear during this time that he resents very much the types of political criticism he gets both in Israel and in the United States. To the extent that I can say it right now, and I reserve the right to change my view in light of more evidence, Aaron's book and things like that, I don't think it mattered in the end. I think it was an irritation to him. But I would not agree with the type of argument that's made in the Walt and Mearsheimer article about the influence of the Jewish lobby on policy. Kissinger frequently complained about it, and he certainly sought sometimes Israel's help, for example, in diffusing the issue of Soviet Jewry and other questions. But I don't think that's the central question or problem that he faces during this time. I mean, one of the problems he really faces is the sheer intractability of many of the Middle Eastern questions that only gave way to time and to a period. In fact, really what he faced also was the reluctance of the United States also to offer the type of commitments that might have brokered peace during that time. And he had to be very careful about the insertion of American presence in the region and when that became more of a possibility, he did get some progress. And I think his agreements did lay the groundwork for the Camp David Accords, but I think within the limits of the time, I don't see the domestic Jewish lobby as playing as significant a role as some have argued.
Yes.
I'm Keith Olson from the University of Maryland. Question on the follow-up on the Middle East. To what extent did Kissinger view the Middle East only, or at least primarily, through the prism of the Cold War? And could he appreciate the problems in the Middle East stemming from the Middle East itself? Could he separate the Middle East from the Cold War?
Excellent question, and I think obviously in any intellectual manner, I think when the argument was presented to him, as it was often, I mean, especially when he dealt with the British or when he dealt with Europeans who sometimes raised that question, he knew it's not a question of intellectually not being able, he fully recognized. The question was one of relative priority, and I think on that, at least during the time that I've been looking at him, and to the extent that I can make a generalization yet, I would argue that no, it still was primarily an issue of the Cold War. He recognized that there were obviously other issues at stake, Israel's security and others, but the central issue that he was concerned about primarily was the question of the diminution of Soviet influence and Soviet involvement in a way that would give the United States a freer hand to finally arrange a peace. So I would probably say, at least for this period of time, he operates with a Cold War framework.
We just have a few minutes left, so let's take a number of hands. Take a couple of questions, starting all the way in the back with Dr. Amini.
Ben Amini, Woodrow Center. Yeah. My question is about the recent happening in Mr. Kissinger's line of thought. Have you seen his letter to one of the newspaper, I think it was the Washington Post, on the Iranian situation? In a situation which he is very familiar, he advised the government that they should get along and with this government and help them, and through them they will bring stability, you know. I imagine it's the stability he wanted to bring with the Shah.
Thank you. We'll go to Professor Nelson.
Hannah Nelson from American University. I haven't been through the tapes, Tom, but I have been through the memoranda and some of the telephone conversations. And I'm struck by the fact, and it's really a question whether you have found this. It seems to me that Kissinger exerted some control by simply controlling the information that got to Nixon. That he was always, I mean, nobody else seemed to get to Nixon, including Bill Rogers. That he was always in control. Is that the case? You've been through so much more material.
Thank you. One more, Ben Schaefer.
Hi, Tom. I have a question with regard of Kissinger's impact on German politics and his reputation in Germany. While he was in office, he was actually held in very high regard with conservatives and social democrats alike. They always thought of Kissinger as, if not one of us, somebody who understands us. With Kissinger in the White House, Germany is really somebody who understands Germany. Now, if you look at all the tapes and the documents you have seen on Germany, Kissinger has, in my opinion, a very negative view on Germany while he's in office. He thinks of Germany in danger of being nationalistic, romantic, sentimental, and all kinds of stereotypes. How do you explain that, given Kissinger's background, that when he's in office, that he manages to have this smooth relationship, almost excellent relationship with all kinds of politicians in Germany, but then on the other hand has this very dark, pessimistic view about the future of Germany and the dangers Germany represents to Europe?
Those are three points, and let me go to them. The question of Kissinger's contemporary views is very interesting. One thing that's absolutely clear is the degree to which Henry Kissinger still wants to be considered a player and still seeks very strongly to exert influence. Your point that his interest is stability, absolutely. That still, in a sense, is something that motivates him. He was on Charlie Rose the other night talking about soccer, but Rose eventually brought around the subject of his meetings with Putin. And Kissinger was relatively sympathetic to Putin because, in fact, as he put it, the 1990s, we saw them as age of democracy in Russia, but it was, to say, chaos, and now Putin has brought stability. It is a question, there's an old question about Henry Kissinger, about the quotation from Goethe about order and justice. Kissinger does seem, to this day, even though he has changed somewhat some of his approaches and thoughts, he still recognizes and values stability, the types of stability brought to a region by even non-democratic or authoritarian governments. So I'm not surprised to see something along those lines, as you mentioned. The memoranda and the control of information. I take your point, Anna, but I still think Nixon reached out through some of his friends occasionally for information, and he did have sort of some informal channels that got to him, political advisors and the rest that had to keep Kissinger honest. Kissinger did control, you might say, the flow of paper into the office, and certainly the exclusion of Rogers and a lot of the State Department material. But I don't think Nixon was without other sources. So I guess I agree with you on one hand in terms of some of the actual mechanics of the process, but I think Nixon still was able to reach out when he wanted to, particularly on economic matters, which Kissinger didn't dominate, but on other matters as well. Finally, the issue of Germany. You make a very good point, Byrne, but of course, Kissinger generally kept his dark thoughts away from the German people he was speaking to. He did not speak to them about that. And to be honest, also, what he said about Germany was actually a fairly widely shared fears among many academics and others about Germany, even under social democratic rule. There was an old line about sort of anti-German feeling being quite common in American academia and American policy circles as a sort of a bias that still exists, the fear that the Germans were unreliable, that right-wing extremism flourished. There was a lot of that. Certainly you can find it in even press reports of the time and other things. So I don't think, in that sense, it's as much. It doesn't surprise me as much. Kissinger could. One of the things about Henry Kissinger was that he did tend to get along with the person he was with, and the person who was with was almost certain that he agreed with him, even if he didn't. Sometimes that was through very nuanced language and very careful use of language. But Kissinger didn't share those doubts with the Germans he dealt with, except, of course, in some ways, he did certainly share certain feelings with German conservatives about the German socialists. It seems, from what I've read, he was less open with German socialists about German conservatives. He didn't seem to trash them in the same way, but he didn't. The silence is deafening on that point. So I think, I guess I'm not all that surprised by the this contradiction of sorts that you find in the documents, given what were, I think, fairly widely held sentiments in American policy circles at the time.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Are there any final? Okay, we'll take just a couple more, and I do want to conclude by 5:30. Jerry Livingston?
I'm Jerry Livingston from the German Historical Institute. Just elaborating on Bernd Schaefer's question, can you differentiate Kissinger's attitudes toward Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt for us?
Okay. Gentleman up front here.
A 100 years from now...
If you could please identify yourself.
Bruce Guthrie, Department of Commerce. 100 years from now, is Henry Kissinger going to be remembered, and what for?
Okay. Wow. And final question down here.
Thank you. Michael Hopkins, Liverpool Hope University. I've just come from the Schaefer conference, which you were attending also, Thomas, and in one of the final panels there was some talk about Henry Kissinger, and one of the accusations, and it was an accusation rather than a historical judgment that was made, was about Kissinger and Nixon delaying the settlement of peace in Vietnam and the loss of American lives. I wonder if you care to comment on their thinking about peace in Vietnam and pulling troops out.
Well, I'm looking at the watch and thinking I've got 3 questions here that are just extraordinary in their richness and what I would like to say about them. Jerry, it is fascinating, the Brandt and Schmidt difference. That's almost, it's this contrast between, Kissinger had a problem with people he identified as, you might say, a certain dreamer or visionary type figures. Willy Brandt struck him that way. And I have found it somewhat interesting because when one thinks of Brandt's personal history, why didn't that connect Kissinger more with him, the idea of this man who had been so courageous in his own resistance to the Nazis? But Willy Brandt, as Helmut Sonnenfeld says, and Dick Smyser talked in very large romantic generalizations at times and seemed to sometimes not all to be as grounded as Henry Kissinger would like. Helmut Schmidt was the exact opposite. Helmut Schmidt was someone Kissinger developed an almost instant rapport with and an ability that they understood each other. They were both exceedingly arrogant individuals who probably also sort of made each other feel even more impressed with each other. That I think in that sense they were perfect, and that was a match that worked in a way that Willy Brandt, perhaps also Kissinger resented some of the celebration of Willy Brandt that took place as well by the American liberal elite. May have been some of that, although that's more what I associate with Nixon, the resentments attached to that. But I think the contrast between Schmidt, the hard-headed pragmatist with interest in very specific issues, able to negotiate with a shared understanding of how an alliance, at least he thought an alliance should work, versus Brandt, and also Brandt's own visions, perhaps connected to German reunification and to things that Kissinger was leery about, led him to have a certain reservation about Willy Brandt. Ironically enough, of course, their pictures both are in the hall in Oslo as holders of the Peace Prize, and it's a fascinating case of where the two men operating at the same time still had this gulf of understanding. 100 years from now, and Henry Kissinger. Wow. I don't know. I mean, the most honest is to say I don't know how he will be looked at in 100 years. It does strike me when I think back about 19th century American diplomats, John Quincy Adams, for example, or perhaps a James Blaine or William Henry Seward, that there is something in Kissinger that's quite similar to them, especially Adams and Seward in some ways, about the willingness, and particularly as I think about it, the connection to John Quincy Adams strikes me. And obviously they operated under extraordinarily different circumstances, but it may well be that American historians 100 years from now will be detached from some of the passions about Vietnam that were referred to in other issues. We'll see in Kissinger's guidance of the United States diplomacy during this time a very wise guidance, at least in terms of the opening to China and the ability to preserve presidential leadership during the crisis of Watergate, the start of a Middle Eastern settlement, if it, of course, perhaps comes about. Obviously, in retrospect, that those things may not seem as important, and a lot will depend on what happens in the next 100 years. But I think he still will be there, just from my own sense in thinking about 19th century American figures. Now, that's not to say that his luster will be somewhat diminished, but I think he still will be seen as a significant figure. Finally, the accusation about the delaying of the settlement in Vietnam. This is a question I've spent a lot of time thinking about because I certainly had that sentiment when I started the project. There is a way in which I think Nixon and Kissinger did calculate the political pros and cons involved in a settlement in Vietnam. They did recognize that if a settlement was reached, say, for example, in early 1971 and came apart by 72, that would hurt him politically. Now, the type of speculation that exists, that certainly is on the tapes, does not then ipso facto mean that they then delayed the settlement. There was another actor in this, namely the North Vietnamese. And until we know a little bit more about North Vietnamese decision-making, I'm reluctant to put it all on Kissinger and Nixon. I think it's pretty clear the North Vietnamese wanted victory. They were determined to win in Vietnam. They thought they had won. And with that type of assessment, they were very reluctant to strike an accord at the time. And they didn't become willing to do so until they recognized that Nixon was going to be around for 4 more years, when it was absolutely clear that George McGovern, who they had hoped would mount a significant challenge, was not going to win. And then they do decide they're willing to separate the political and military issues and allow for, you might say, a type of military disentanglement of the United States and the return of prisoners, in return for which the war will simply go on, which is pretty much what the Paris Peace Accords did, despite what Kissinger said about them and what others said about them. It basically simply allowed for an American disentanglement and for the war to continue. So in that sense, I think you have to factor in the North Vietnamese, and I think because Kissinger and Nixon might have speculated on it, doesn't immediately prove that this was that they had in their power the ability to have gotten the type of settlement they did in 1971, and that they deliberately delayed it.
Thank you, Tom. I think the notion that we'll have to await or hold judgment on some of these matters pending further information on North Vietnamese decision-making is a good one to end up a Cold War International History Project seminar. Let me thank you, Tom, for a fascinating, stimulating presentation here, not just presentation, but also the discussion. Let me also say how wonderful, I think I can say this on behalf of all of my colleagues here at the Wilson Center, how wonderful it's been to have had you here at so many levels, to have had you here for the last 5-6 months. We hope you will be back again soon, hopefully for the book launch, and good luck with the project.
Well, I'll come back for the book launch. I also want to come back for Christian's book launch, too, but that's another story.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Christian.
Much more than I work in progress.
I wish I